She was still smiling when he said it. That was the worst part. 10 seconds earlier, she had believed he was about to crown her Luna. 10 seconds earlier, her heart had been so full it almost hurt. The chandeliers were lit. Every candle in that hall burning. The gowns, the goblets, the faces. Everything glittering the way things do on nights that feel almost too perfect. The kind of night that makes something deep in your stomach whisper, "Wait." She ignored it. She had been waiting 3 years for this. 3 years as the promised mate of Labarnus, Alpha of Black Ridge. 3 years learning his habits, his politics, his preferences. 3 years becoming exactly what she thought he needed. And then the goblet slipped from her fingers, before she even felt it fall. The sound of it hitting the marble was the loudest thing in the room.
Welcome to Mene's Romance Library.
I, Labarnus, Alpha of Black Ridge, he began, his cold, arrogant bass filling the hall without effort. Reject you, Kubaba, he intoned, with the quiet finality of a man signing a document. The hall did not gasp. It froze. Every single person in that room went completely still. Fabric shifted. Rings clicked against crystal. Someone nearby inhaled too sharply, and she was still holding her smile, because her body had not caught up with what her ears had just heard. Her brain kept saying, "Wait, replay that. That cannot be right." But it was. He was not done. "You lack the fortitude required of my mate," he said, with cold, resonant authority that needed no volume to land. "I will not bind my legacy to hesitation," he declared, his bass voice dropping the word like a gavel. Hesitation. That was the word he chose. Not weakness, not betrayal. Hesitation. Polite, careful, absolutely devastating. Her pulse was roaring in her ears. She watched him turn, just slightly, and Lady Sarya stepped closer to his side. She did not say a word. She did not have to. The message was written in the way she moved. In the way he allowed it. Replacement secured. The nobles began whispering, and they were not whispering about love. They were whispering about trade routes, about alliances, about which houses would now move closer to which throne. And she stood there, in a ceremonial white gown that suddenly felt as heavy as stone. And she realized something terrible. She had never been a bride to him. She had been a contract. She swallowed hard. "Do not break here. Do not give them the satisfaction." And then Labarnus raised his goblet again. Smooth, composed, completely unbothered. And he added one final thing. "I trust that Kubaba will conduct herself with dignity," he said, lifting his goblet with the casual arrogance of a man who has already won. Dignity. She almost laughed out loud. The sheer audacity of that word coming from his mouth. She had spent 3 years being dignified for him. 3 years of biting her tongue, softening her opinions, reshaping herself around his comfort. She had almost signed away her own values to stand beside him. Almost. Because 3 weeks before this night, Labarnus had handed her a decree, a southern expansion plan, clean on paper, monstrous, underneath. It would have erased 3 lower houses, displaced real families, removed people from land their grandparents had built on, all for optics. And she had looked him in the eye and said no. Not loudly, not dramatically. She had simply said, "I cannot stand beside you for this." He had smiled then too. She had not understood why, until tonight. She was not rejected because she was weak. She was rejected because she refused to obey. And now she was standing in the middle of that hall, alone, while the world watched and waited to see if she would fall apart. She told herself, "Breathe. Just breathe." And then the balcony doors opened. Not violently. not dramatically. Deliberately. The sound cut through the entire hall, like a blade through silence. Every head turned, every single one. He stood there, framed against the light from outside. No escort, no announcement, no apology. Yarim, the exiled king. She had heard stories about him. Everyone had. But stories do not prepare you for the way a person commands a room, simply by entering it. He descended the staircase slowly, as though this hall had once belonged to him. And perhaps, in some ways, it had. He did not look at the nobles. He did not look at Labarnus. He looked at her. Not at her gown, not at her humiliation, at her. And something about that, something about being truly seen in the worst moment of her life, made her breath catch. "You are not welcome here," Labarnus called out, his cold, resonant bass carrying without effort across the frozen hall. Yarim did not stop walking. "You ended it publicly," he rumbled quietly, still descending the stairs. "Before witnesses," he added, his voice settling over the hall like something permanent. "This is not your affair," Labarnus barked, and his gravelly bass snapping with barely contained fury. "On the contrary," Yarim replied, his voice a steady, unhurried rumble. "Ancient blood law makes it precisely my affair," he said, with the respectful gravity of a man who had prepared for this moment for a very long time. The room tightened instantly. Even the people who despised Yarim knew the law existed. Rare. Dangerous. Binding. "If a mate is rejected during formal assembly," he began, his deep rumble measured and deliberate, "so another alpha of standing may claim her," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of something ancient. "Provided she consents," he finished, his voice dropping the word into the silence like a coin into still water. Consent. That one word dropped into the room like a match falling into dry grass. She could feel the energy shift. The elders straightened. The whispers stopped. "You would claim what I have discarded?" Labarnus said with a short, gravelly laugh, each word coated in contempt. He laughed as he said it, the kind of laugh that is really just fury wearing a mask. "You discarded her because she would not bend to your council's demand," Yarim stated, his deep rumble carrying no heat, only the weight of what was true. A ripple moved through the elders. She saw Labarnus's eyes flicker. That was new. That was something he had not expected. "You refused to sign the Southern Expansion Decree," Yarim said, his deep voice placing each word like testimony. "The one that would have displaced 3 lower houses," he finished, his tone carrying no accusation, only fact. Her heart stopped completely. He knew. He actually knew. He knew why Labarnus had truly rejected her. The real reason. The reason no one else in that room had figured out. "You mistake sentiment for strength," Labarnus snapped, his gravelly bass fracturing at the edges for the first time. "And you mistake obedience, or for loyalty," Yarim replied, his voice a low, unhurried rumble that asked for nothing, and gave everything. Silence detonated across the hall. Not the polite kind, not the waiting kind. The kind of silence that tells you something just cracked open, and will never fully close again. And then Yarim turned to her. Not for the crowd. Not for the politics. Just to her. "Kubaba," he said, her name a quiet rumble, given to her alone. "You were cast aside, for having a conscience," he said, with a respectful gravity that carried no performance whatsoever. "That is not weakness," he said quietly, the words landing in the silence like something solid and permanent. Her eyes burned. Do you know how long she had been told that her conscience was the problem? That she was too sensitive, too careful, too principled for a world like this? That she needed to be practical, bend, to become smaller. And here was this man, exiled, discredited, standing in a hall full of people who despised him, calling her values strength. Under ancient blood law, Yarim began, his deep voice carrying the formality of the ancient words carefully. I offer you a place. Beside me, he said, his rumble quiet enough that only she and the silence could properly hear it. Not beneath me. Not hidden, he finished, his voice holding the offer open without pressure. He extended his hand. And she stood there, heart pounding so hard it physically hurt, and thought through everything. If she took his hand, they would call it ambition. They would say she moved from one powerful man straight to another. If she refused, she would remain the woman who hesitated, the woman who was discarded and had nothing to show for it. But then she looked at Labarnus, and she saw it, the calculation behind his eyes. He had not expected this. He had not expected anyone to challenge him tonight. He had expected her to simply absorb the humiliation and disappear quietly. That realization shifted something deep inside her. She stepped forward, and she placed her hand in Yarim's. The hall erupted. The estate was nothing like she had imagined. Quiet. Not cold, not threatening, just quiet. She waited for the shift, for the moment the mask would come off, for the control to begin. It never did. No guards posted outside her chamber, no locked doors, no rules spoken like warnings. You are free to leave, Yarim said, his deep, unhurried voice carrying the words as simple fact. The gates are not barred to you, he added, without looking up from what he was doing. He had said it that first evening, almost casually, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She looked at him for a long moment. Then why claim me? She asked softly, her voice quiet and genuine, barely above a breath. Because leaders are revealed in crisis, Yarim replied, his deep voice unhurried, as though he had already known the answer before she asked. Labarnus revealed fear, he said quietly. I prefer courage, he finished, the words carrying no flattery, only observation. And you believe I am courageous? She asked, with a vulnerable higher pitch creeping into her voice despite herself. I believe you are inconvenient, he said, the dry warmth of it completely unexpected. Something about that made her laugh for the first time in days. A real laugh. Small, but real, and they talked. Night after night, they talked. Not about romance, not about law or strategy at first. About people, about what leading them actually costs. He had been exiled for refusing to approve a purge. Not because he was violent, because he was not. The people in power had rewritten the story around him, until he looked like the dangerous one. And slowly, quietly, something in her began to admire him, not because he had stepped in to save her, but because he had never once, tried to own her. And then the summons arrived. Emergency council. All houses required to attend. Labarnus wanted her returned, not as a mate, not as someone he valued, as an obligation, as something he was still owed. The second banquet was more crowded than the first. Scandal draws spectators. Everyone wanted to see how this ended. You have made your spectacle, Labarnus said, his bass voice carrying the casual authority of a man closing an account. Return her, he commanded, each word a stone dropped from height. Black Ridge does not relinquish its promised alliances, he declared, his voice the temperature of marble. Promised. That was the word he used. Not loved, not chosen, not wanted, promised. Yarim did not argue back. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her and waited. The elders began talking over each other, voices layering and building. Property. Territory. Precedent. Ancient law versus current practice. And she felt it. The old cage trying to close around her again. The familiar pressure. The expectation that she would stand quietly while others decided her future. And then something became very clear to her. The bond had not shattered because she was rejected. It had shattered because she refused to become what Labarnus required. She stepped forward. The voices slowed, then stopped. "You do not want me," she said clearly, her breathy voice carrying further than anyone expected. "Excuse me?" Labarnus barked, his gravelly bass cracking with controlled fury. "You want to win?" she said softly, her voice barely above a breath. "There is a difference," she finished, the simplicity of it landing harder than any accusation. His jaw tightened. "You rejected me the moment I refused to support your decree?" she said, her soft voice gaining ground without raising in volume. "You stood in that hall and called it hesitation," she continued, each word clear and deliberate. "But we both know the truth," she whispered, with a catch in her voice she could not entirely suppress. "I said no." "And you could not forgive it," she said softly, her breathy voice holding every year of it. A murmur moved through the elders. This was no longer a conversation about romance or law. This had become a conversation about governance, about what kind of leader demands silence, instead of earning trust. "You would choose exile? Over your own house?" Labarnus demanded, on the first splinter of uncertainty entering his heavy bass voice. She paused. She turned slightly toward Yarim. He was watching her. No urgency in his expression. No expectation. He had never once told her what to choose. She turned back. "I choose neither of you," she said softly, the words falling into the silence like something final and irreversible. The hall went absolutely still. "I will not be claimed like a trophy passed between two competing thrones," she said, her voice still soft but carrying to every corner of the stone hall. Labarnus looked stunned, truly stunned. And Yarim's expression did not fall, but something in it shifted. Something quiet and attentive. "I will form my own alliance," she said, her voice gaining a new kind of steadiness. "With the southern houses you have both been debating over for months," she continued, the soft certainty in her voice more devastating than volume could ever be. Shock moved through the room in waves. "I have their support already," she said quietly, "because while you were both competing over dominance, I was listening to them," she finished, her breathy voice carrying the words like something that had been true for a long time. She let that land. "I do not need to be Luna of Black Ridge," she said softly. "And I do not need to be Queen of Exile," she added, her voice holding both without a tremor. She stepped back, standing alone, steady. "Leadership is not about who claims me," she said, barely above a breath. "It is about what I build," she finished, her voice light and certain and immovable. The silence that followed was absolute. Not stunned silence. Not angry silence. The silence of an entire room, recalculating everything they thought they knew. Labarnus looked uncertain for the very first time. And Yarim looked impressed. Not possessive. Not competitive. Genuinely, quietly, impressed. The court did not bow. They recalculated. And as she walked out of that banquet hall, not beside either Alpha, not trailing behind anyone, but ahead of all of them, the future shifted. Not because she was chosen, but because she chose herself. And that was the one move no one saw coming.
If this story moved something inside you, you already understand what it means. Some of us spend years becoming smaller, so someone else feels bigger. And the day we stop, that is not weakness. That is the beginning. Like this video if Kubaba's choice hit differently. Subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. And drop a comment below. What was the moment that changed everything for you? I will be reading every single one.